We were leaving off when we talked about one of what's considered the greatest intellectual crisis of the Middle Ages, and much of it has to do with that term that so many of us see in the books and the shows on the Middle Ages, the age of faith. You've always heard that, the age of faith. And this, of course, has to do with how the reaction to that is going to be. And that is to say, how, if you are essentially basing your belief system on Christian Catholicism, how are you then going to deal with the power of reason and logic? And that will be a very difficult problem for them to consider. Many of you who know about early Christianity may have heard the name Tertullian. He was a North African lawyer who became very famous in the early church. Because you know North Africa is part of the Roman Empire, so he was highly educated and became a very, very Christian, and for that he suffered death. During his writing, he would declare things like the crucifixion and resurrection, I believe, are true because they are impossible. And basically, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem, which for our purpose is even more important, because what he meant was Athens equals all the learning of the past. What has that got to do with our Christian faith, meaning Jerusalem? Why do we need Athens? In other words, for people like Tertullian, who are hardly ignoramuses, who are classically trained and well informed about reason, for new Christians, and we are in the 2nd century after Christ, so I'm still calling it new. You don't need reason anymore. However, then we have new Christians also martyred, from whom we get the term martyr, Justin Martyr, as he's known, because of the great sacrifice that he made. He was a scholar of note before he became Christian. And so becoming Christian was in some ways a kind of agony for him intellectually, because he wondered about all that he had learned during his lifetime now that he was baptized Christian. And that's why he came out with an idea that seems, to me at least, a very interesting one, and that is that all can be Christian by anticipation. That is to say, they knew as much of truth as it was possible for them to know. So, for example, if you're Greek and you have followed the ways of philosophy and the ethical system that it provides, you are a Christian by anticipation. And the same way with pre-Christian Jews who have followed their Judaic belief. So, in other words, there is an acceptance of reason on the part of Justin, and a sense that you don't need to throw out all of your logic books simply because you're now a Christian. These are two very different points of view, because Tertullian has no further use for philosophy, even though he knew it. He knew philosophy, he'd studied it, for goodness sakes. He was a lawyer. So that is in no way then a final answer. These fellows are in the 2nd century, and we are simply beginning, really, in this medieval conflict of knowledge. And by the way, for those who Remember this word from the Gospel according to John, logos. In the beginning was the Word. There you go. And there it is. Thank you, Brenda. It's right there. The conflict, essentially, as to whether you believe by faith and by the authority vested in those who are appointed by God, so it was said, to lead the church, I should say, versus those who ascertain truth according to logic or according to science. Whatever may be the sources of that truth, it would seem for many there was a sense of conflict. And as a result, when in the High Middle Ages, the scholars of the day, you know, last time how we talked about universities and all the scholars who are getting more and more knowledge, much of which comes from down south in Spain. That's right, it's coming from the Arabs. They get Arabic and Hebraic translations from the Greek. And then, thank goodness, Carol, they translate them into Latin. Yeah. So that people like Carol will have them, so, you know, a set of Aristotle for your bedtime reading, right? Yeah, that'll put you, oh, you don't need Simon X on those nights, believe me. Oh, yeah, that will get you well into bed. So, the amazing thing is that it didn't come directly from Greek into Latin. They will, later on, get direct translations, but it goes from these different stages to reach Western scholars who apparently could read the Arabic and Hebraic better than they could read the Greek. Now, some of Aristotle's works had been translated centuries before, but I'm speaking in general of the whole mass of them. And Aristotle, for all of these centuries of people before the scientific revolution, was up there with the ultimate source of authority. If it's not in Aristotle, then it doesn't matter. It was all right there. It's amazing to think that one person could carry that kind of weight. I used to tell my students in my own day, the only person I could think of on that level was Einstein. And then they would look back at me like, who? Sad, really, but yeah. But at least I know you can understand. Albert Einstein, you know, that was just, wow. But that's the way they felt in these medieval times about Aristotle. As Dante called him, the master of those who know. And medieval scholars would not have to be told who was the master of those. You don't need any further explanation. Because though pagan, Aristotle truly had written on virtually every sort of area of learning. Political science, biology, and physics, and all the rest of it, to the extent that his word was considered almost sacred. If you were going to write anything about Aristotle, it was merely to try to expand on it. But you would never, of course, bring it under attack. This man, Anselm of Canterbury, was a somewhat controversial Archbishop of Canterbury in standing up to a king of his day. Two of them, actually. But Anselm was also a philosopher. And he was not afraid to use logic in order to prove certain ideas of faith. Anselm would always say, you know, I do not need philosophy to be a believer, but it's useful in demonstrating certain religious truths, if that makes sense. He used a field of philosophy, and again, there's so many bright people in here. I'm not terribly knowledgeable about the field of ontology, but if any of you hanging out are ontologists secretly or openly, please be my guest. That is some heavy-duty philosophical talk about the nature of existence. And ontologically speaking, St. Anselm was able to prove why God exists. There is something to the effect, and you might correct me, the God is the greater than which there can be no other. Yeah. And so, logically, step by step, he would go that way. Then there is, for Carol, cur Deus homo. Why did God become man? And that is, in effect, showing logically why God chose to assume human form for salvation. In other words, assuming God had certain logical choices to make, and this was the most logical choice. In other words, logically explaining the incarnation. Now, he is not writing for the benefit of the society of militant atheists. Anselm always said, I am not in any way trying here to write to the non-believers. I'm merely trying to demonstrate Christian truth to the believers. And I'm doing so with these weapons of philosophy and doing quite a good job of it. And this, of course, is the ultimate quotation by St. Anselm. So it's so good I had to put it up there. For I do not seek to understand in order that I may believe, but I believe in order that I may understand. So Christian belief must come first in order to have understanding. And the understanding then will simply be amplified by the logic. And then this is very, very important to appreciate, A, that he was using logic, but B, he was also devoutly Christian, accepting the premise of Christianity, that is the incarnation and resurrection, before he was using any of this logic in the first place. So belief comes first for St. Anselm. And then, of course, there is the bad boy, Peter Abelard. You remember how we talked about his getting in trouble last time. Bad trouble. And for some who need it, Carol, right up there for you, and for others, we have the English version who are not blessed. So I didn't want to make her get up here and do a translation for us. But by doubting, we come to inquiry, and through inquiry, we perceive truth. And Abelard's words say to the 21st century audience, I imagine, well, yeah, that sounds good. That sounds like something we ought to be doing. We ought to be starting with some doubt and wondering. Well, that's good for you, but this is the 12th century. And people like Abelard and other so-called scholastics, from schola, meaning school, scholars, for Abelard and other scholastics who are, after all, getting fed 3 times a day and have a roof under their head. Thank you, church. They're not interested in hearing about any doubts. What doubts? Then why are you accepting a position from us, huh? Yeah, we've got a problem here. Abelard, who was trying to make inquiries, philosophically speaking, in his position as a Christian professor, made many people feel he was troubled. I told you last time, I believe, about his book called Yes and No, when he would set up statements of church fathers that seemed to contradict each other. So obviously this is an individual who's not seeking to bring peace and harmony. And a lot of people think he needs to be stifled, to put it just openly. Yeah, exactly. Archie, I'm sure Archie wouldn't have liked him if he'd known what he was saying. Don't think Archie had any Latin.
Was he the one, Abelard, was he the one
yes.
who was the
tutor? Yeah. Mm-hmm. He had trouble, made the boo-boo, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, yes. Yes, Abelard had a very interesting life, and when he wrote his autobiography and called it the Story of My Calamities, I think we can appreciate it from both a physical and intellectual point of view. Yeah, I mean, it's just very, very bad. That was mid-12th when Abelard was working. Then comes the work of Averroes, who really stirs the mix. Averroes was Muslim from Spain, a great philosopher in his own right, and an authority in Aristotelianism. We shouldn't be surprised that Muslim civilization had already dealt in various locales with the mass of Aristotle's works that they had obtained from Greek sources. And perhaps not surprisingly, Averroes had troubles too. And he had troubles because of the fact that Muslim authorities as well as Christian authorities did not exactly like the idea of challenges of other kinds. In other words, we are the final word. And Averroes' work then, and he was known in the West as Averroes, so that's the name we'll use here. The idea of Averroism that made it to Paris, because the versions of Aristotle that these scholars like Abelard were reading would have Averroes' notes. It's sort of like comments explaining his interpretation of what Aristotle was saying. Kind of deep, and this made it a little bit easier, I guess, for them to understand it. But of course, he had his own ideas. And his own ideas, sometimes called the double truth, is that his Islamic faith is true and Aristotle's ideas are true. We just need to keep them apart so that no mixing. I'm like a child with the peas and the carrots. We don't want them to touch. And so they just stay in their own piles, and then everybody is going to be happy as can be, no conflict, no issues of controversy. Well, it didn't go over well at the mosque, I can tell you that, down south. And it went over no better in the Catholic Church. The idea that there could be two separate truths. So these Latin Averroists, who were, of course, scholars in their own right at what became Sorbonne, the University of Paris, were debating all of this, in their meetings, I guess, faculty meetings, or pretty heavy-duty stuff. And I'm sure one of them was probably, how does my student say it? Ratting them out to the Bishop of Paris. Hey, Your Grace, guess what they're discussing today? Yeah, that kind of thing. So they're talking about two truths. Oh, hitting the roof, huh? You just know. So, each was supposedly valid, what we know by faith and what we know rationally, in two separate spheres. That is what Averroes taught to accompany Aristotle, and that's why we call it Latin Averroism, because they merely picked it up. And they were discussing it in the academic world. Well, Averroes was condemned, as were these Latin Averroists, by their prospective authorities. We even have the document, the Bishop of Paris, condemning various assertions by Latin Averroists having to do with Aristotelian ideas like the eternity of the world or the unity of the soul. There is a world soul, and all of that. There was no first man like Adam, and so forth and so forth. All of this means that these university scholars have really got their world stirred up, and dealing with church authorities is very difficult. And one of the great scholars, I found this, I thought this was so interesting, that people still find him as interesting as I do. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. He was one of the greatest of all the scholars of the day. He was a Cistercian. If you know that order, they still exist today. Quite famous for their wine. And Saint Bernard was a leading scholar, and he made it his job to pursue Abelard with all he could get. He could not stand Abelard. Nothing to do with his morals. Everything to do with his philosophy. Everything to do with St. Bernard's deep abiding faith in God and the total rejection that articles of faith should ever be diluted by rational thought. He believed in writing about them theologically, but not challenging them with any kinds of reasoned doubts or anything of the like. So St. Bernard of Clairvaux, they were reconciled before they died, but St. Bernard of Clairvaux was not someone you didn't want to be on your side. So he was a very powerful individual. He had his own writings. I mean, he was not merely a hound sent out by the authorities. Yes, St. Bernard. What did I say? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. St. Bernard. Okay. Thank you, Janet. I'm a little slow. But if you got that, seeking knowledge known by others, that is vanity. And I really like that, because you can imagine what he thought about Peter Abelard was just pressing around, trying to say, oh, well, I'm the smartest one around. And so they had their differences, and very interestingly then, they were reconciled. Now, if this looks familiar at all, you are looking at St. Thomas Aquinas. Especially for those of you reared in the Catholic traditions, that will be a well-known name. One of the most brilliant of theologians and philosophers. I wanted to show this painting to you because he was so brilliant. He came from an outstanding family, and you talk about small world. His mother was kin to the family of Frederick Barbarossa. Remember the Hohenstaufen Emperor? Yeah. Think of the reunions. Yeah. So he was definitely of the aristocratic family sort from northern Italy. And you see his date. So he is really at the tail end of our period now, the High Middle Ages. He died as a celebrated philosopher and theologian, but it was said that he burned every copy of all the works he'd written before he died. He decided to become a mystic. He decided that was the only way to find truth, by direct communion with God. So he could be a strange fellow, and he was probably not into meeting the public or getting out. He was there to be a scholar. And if you were going to be a student of his, I imagine it was pretty serious at that level.
Aren't there writings of St. Thomas Aquinas?
Yes, definitely. Because he rejected the idea of learning to become truly Christian. He said none of that is necessary. All you need to do, he thought after all that learning, would throw it all away and simply accept God. And you know, that's what mysticism is about. Fasting and contemplating to reach that. He died at 49 years old. And I have no idea. You know, but let's face it, health was pretty uncertain even in an upper class life. I imagine he just stopped eating, if you want to know the truth. He was a heavy fellow when he was older, I'll say that. But he did become a great scholar. And the interesting story here is to notice the photograph. Here, apparently, his brothers, his naughty brothers, got tired of him studying all the time and praying. So, can you see in the back beyond the wings? Can you see a woman? If you look down now by the saint, you'll see a piece of wood. What at hand, there is the fireplace. His brothers must have hired someone who were trying to get the scholar away from his philosophical contemplations of Aristotle. If you understand what she had in mind for a price. Wickedness and evil. Carnality. Yes. So apparently the saint, imbued with the Spirit of the Lord, got this piece of wood in the fire and chased her out with it, rejecting any effort at impurity. Just wanted to share straight from the files of St. Thomas Aquinas. That's what you do when you meet bad people. Chase them out of the room and see how the angels have come to comfort him. Good work, Tommy. You know, that kind of thing. So, that meant, so we have no interruptions. We can focus now on our writing. And we can be a Dominican. Now, we'll be talking about those orders later. But for now, notice that they wanted him to be a Benedictine because they thought about that as being more upper class. Believe it or not, they thought of Dominicans as sort of, but you should be an abbot in a Benedictine house so we can hold up our heads. You know, this is, if you're going to be a monk, at least be an upper class monk. So that's the idea. But it turns out that during his lifetime, Dominicans became more and more the scholars of the monastic world, so that was okay for him. What he did at Paris was, of course, to study Aristotle as he continued to attempt to understand Aristotelian ideas in terms of Catholic theology. He never, ever would have thought of leaving behind the Catholic Church to follow Aristotle. Never. So that idea never occurred to him. But he did believe there had to be one truth. Therefore, Averroes' idea had to go. And that is what he is most famous for. And that, of course, is why his name is so recognized in Catholic circles. So many churches are named for him. And I mean, it's rough going. Now, this is not something you would want to pick up. And I don't think Cliff Notes has any kind of help for you. I mean, but you'd wish for one. I mean, you would look for that familiar, comforting yellow and black. Oh, yeah. Some of you will remember people who use those things. Yes. I don't condemn anybody. We are not here to censure. But we know. Ah, there he is. Say, he's in later life now. In his 40s, right? That's later life, sad, isn't it? But yeah, but that was the way he looked. And among his works, most, if you were to ask people, you know, what work do you think of when you think of Thomas? They'd say Summa Theologica. That is the usual work mentioned. As such, he would use logic to prove articles of faith when it could be done. In other words, he believed that Aristotelian teachings, including the use of logic, were significant when they could buttress Catholic truth. But he was never any kind of schizophrenic that was, I'm a Christian, I'm a philosopher. No. There was one truth, and Aristotle and other philosophers are here merely to buttress Catholic truth when they can. If they can't, then they're wrong. So, for example, an idea of the eternity of the earth, well, obviously that doesn't fit in with church teaching, so it can't be true. So when there is two points of view, but when he can show it, and I mean, the Summa Theologica is long, multi-volumed, and so you can imagine to accomplish all of that before you're 50. And I mean, he did lead a life as a professor and taught at Paris and so forth and so on. So he's a very, very significant person. And he, I will not say, ended the idea of Latin Averroism, but he certainly did provide an alternative to it. And that, I guess, is the most significant. By the time he died, he was already a star as far as, and of course, accepted by the church. I mean, it wasn't as if he was being brought up for anything he said. He was hardly approved by those who could understand what he was saying, because this is not something that everyone could completely get at. But they got at, there's only one source of all knowledge, so there can't be any conflict in it. The individual you see before you, we're going to get into what caused his death, in the spring. It was the Black Death, if you'll notice the date, 1349. But he was a Franciscan. And you know, Franciscans and Dominicans sometimes have their problems. And whether or not that was true in this case, William of Ockham was a scholar at Oxford and a Franciscan who apparently said so many bad things about Thomas Aquinas' work that he put on bread and water for a few weeks. Because he already, you know, Aquinas already had the reputation when this William of Ockham was a young friar. But he was a brilliant scholar too. And he wrote highly critically of Thomas' idea. Essentially what he said was, nothing can be demonstrated that is theological by human reason. And that just throws it all out. That's to say then, human reason and observation should be used for science. But they are utterly and totally inadequate to demonstrate any article of faith. Period. So you can just imagine if you're in the Dominican order or you are a fan of St. Thomas Aquinas, who was long gone by Ockham's day, that this individual... What were you going to say?
I just wondered, can you explain how Occam's razor?
Occam's razor. Do you all, yeah, everybody knows that phrase. Because Occam believed that, you've never heard that before. It means essentially that in philosophy you need to cut to the sharpest point and extract anything that is essentially extraneous, or to make those points. And Occam was a philosopher of many accomplishments. I just happened to bring him up in this context because he got into lots of hot water, even though I'm sure he had many supporters. But his idea of denouncing Thomas had already begun to get a big reputation. And way over in England, Occam is writing and critically of Thomas' ideas, and he got in lots of trouble. But he did lots of other things too that I can't get into at this time. I mean, he denounced the papacy, and that's not good. I mean, these people are getting your bread and butter and getting a roof over your head, and you have to be real careful what you say. You have to say it in a loving way. And that didn't go over well. So you don't see an ST before William of Ockham, do you? Does that give you any idea maybe about he was not on the list? So he was highly critical. And of course, Dante loves Thomas Aquinas. In the Paradiso, and I found this illustration, and I know my friends in literature will remember this particular scene in the Paradiso, because here you see Francis and Dominic hanging out, and there's Dante with his friend Beatrice, and you think, well, who is over them? Well, that's St. Thomas Aquinas saying, y'all have a nice chat, and this is just great. I mean, everybody's just happy as can be, and of course, Dante is saying, wow, paradise is so great. So there's no dispute between Dominic and Francis. They're crazy about each other. He said, well, that's the way it is here with all of us STs. So you can't do much better than that. Dominic and Francis are right there in unity. And Thomas Aquinas is sort of with them as observed by Dante and his escort Beatrice. And more of that later.
Were St. Francis and St. Dominic, did they live at the same time?
Yes.
And were they enemies?
Well, they were perceived as enemies, but they weren't really. But their followers became enemies because they were intellectual competitors in some ways. And, but they were both they were founded as friars, committed to helping the poor and retrieving those who had fallen away from the faith. And we're going to get into that, I hope, next week, Thursday. Seem to be having a problem here, but maybe I can't get it, but I can tell you this. That's one last photograph of a picture of Thomas. But the idea is that in the 19th century, the ideas of Thomism, that is, of St. Thomas Aquinas, will be accepted by the Catholic Church as the foundation of their intellectual belief system. So you have all these controversies with people like William of Ockham and all the rest of it. And that's a long time if you have to wait to be, made official to the 19th century, but that's okay. It was there in all of its multiple volumes and all of its teachings. And so far as I am aware, it has remained so ever since. I guess that was the 1870s. That the Catholic Church still considers Thomas Aquinas' works fundamental to their intellectual understanding of theology and philosophy together. And we'll take a break, and then we'll be ready to start on some Crusades. Yeah. Because we were just discussing discipline in Dominican education, and so you're lucky that I'm not a Dominican, because I think there could be all kinds of trouble for any recalcitrant among you. Yeah. The Crusades are probably, and I think I'm right about this, are probably the most discussed and written about topic in medieval history. I'm almost prepared to back that up. When you go to websites, it is just, not even to mention the bibliography, but just the number of people who are interested in that subject. And as a matter of fact, at Auburn, our scholar in the field actually teaches a course in them. He calls it Jihad and Crusade, a comparative study of the two religions' military efforts. And I'm sure that is fascinating because he is an expert in both. So very, very interesting indeed. This is merely an introduction to the subject, I'll say, but a very, I hope, interesting one when we consider the implications for both the medieval world and the worlds upon whose broad shoulders medieval world had been born. Because it's not just the Muslim world, but also we have to consider in this the Byzantine world, which is a very important player in this whole process. The possibility of seeing all of this from one map essentially shows matters a lot simpler than they really were, but I guess it's still useful to see that you've got in orange Christian lands and Muslim lands in green. And then I thought most important was to see the routes that they took from the Western world to the Holy Land and to the rest of these territories, and noting that they go both ways. They go by land and they go by sea as well. And I think that's very important when, as we're about to, begin our consideration. And note they go on, at least the first four, the major ones as they are called, from the late 11th century to the beginning of the 13th. So we're right where we should be in terms of saying this is a high medieval phenomenon. Why didn't it go on before? Well, as we're going to see, they just weren't ready in most ways for these great events. The Crusades taking up the cross of Christ against, as they said, Christ's enemies.
What was on the previous slide, what was that whole beige area up at the top?
Meaning they're neither Christian nor Muslim. Pagans. So, yeah, they're still... Now they're telling me that if I keep doing this back and forth, that somehow... well, this is there someone there? Isn't it? Oh, he's going to do it. There we go. Thank you. The first point is to say, and I think it, again, if you stop and think about it, you have to have a society that is consciously Christian, that they really feel Christian. Remember, this takes a process of centuries to bring about. And when they do so, then, of course, for those who are following a different religion, a religion, of course, that follows Christianity. I mean, there was no Islam when Christianity was born. So as a result, of course, that creates the idea of Christians versus the other. And that is, to me, highly significant in understanding how this could have happened from the outset. And the second part of that has to do with the pilgrims. As the Catholics among us will know, pilgrimages are considered a very virtuous act. And apparently, pilgrimages from the West to the Holy Land in previous centuries were not uncommon at all. However, in the recent times prior to the Crusades, there was concern about the security and safety of people who went on the Crusades. More about that later. But note that that was an issue, some say. I hope you remember Gregory VII and Henry IV. It is said, and I believe it, that the popes after Gregory VII wanted to show who's in charge. And the First Crusade is definitely a papal initiative. It begins while the followers of Gregory VII are still in control of the papacy. And they want to show these emperors in this investiture controversy that the Pope is the leader of the Christian community. And as we're going to see, they certainly demonstrated that in 1095. Interestingly, the Byzantines will act for assistance. So often we ask for help and we get help, but not the kind we were asking for and not in the right sort. Thank you. Definitely, as we are going to see, the Turks were a concern for the Byzantine Empire. And so, despite their distaste for the Westerners, who were called the Franks in general, as in barbarians, the Byzantines didn't like them, but they thought they could use their help. Didn't turn out that way. And then, of course, join the military, see the world, have adventures. It seems, believe it or not, that many of the church leaders encourage these younger sons and other military people without any sort of status or place. Why don't you join this venture? That will be a good activity for you. And because if you are a younger son, you have limited choices. You know, like, what am I going to do when I grow up? And they say, well, you could go on a crusade. There are all kinds of new opportunities out there, and you just don't know, and you love the Lord, don't you? Oh, yes, sir. So, hey, you would be perfect. It is amazing to think, though, people can get sold that bill of goods, but it was very, very popular. And for rulers, including the Pope, it was an idea of sort of getting a lot of the more troublesome elements out of town. They can be busy doing something else, like going off somewhere fighting, and then they won't be here to retard the church's efforts to encourage rulers to maintain order, because it is getting to be a more orderly society, relatively speaking. But as you see when you read the Pope's sermon, he will mention that you could be a young man who had lived a life of some wickedness, but if you are killed fighting in this, you are pretty well instantly saved. I mean, you're in. So it's a great, great opportunity for all concerned. So that's why I call it law and order. The church's interest had always been in preserving order, because the church thrives in order. The church had instituted programs, one called the Peace of God, when warriors promised under pain of excommunication that they would not fight from Friday through Sunday night. And get up Monday morning, let's go hit them. But that was called the Peace of God. And then there was the Truce of God. You wouldn't fight during Lent, like a time like now. And so to honor the faith. So and then of course there were the non-combatants. It was considered very bad to attack monks and nuns and things like that. No matter what problems you might have had in school with them, you were still to respect their person, because I guess. And you don't attack peasants or people like that. That's just rude. I mean, they're not. You know, I mean, they're not part of this. It's just us. We do this. So they should be out there going somewhere else and helping restore the Holy Land to a status so that the faithful can visit there and worship. In specific, everyone seems to mention the Battle of Manzikert, because we now have these people called the Turks. I think we mentioned those back in the fall. In fact, I know we did. They just come in the Muslim world in the mid-11th century, but they got caught up. They came to dominate the Arabs by and large. As they converted to the Islamic faith, and they became the major players, politically speaking, in this Islamic world. I mean, they caught up. Of course, this does not mean that Islamic roots are not Arabic. They are, very much. But politically speaking, much of this world became Turkish dominated. So, follow, if you will, in the area. You see where Constantinople is in red, all right? And that's modern Istanbul in Turkey. And then look way over there in green is where Manzikert is.
Is that Sicilia? Right next to it?
Yes, you see that right there, and then down there, exactly. And that's modern day Turkey. Yeah, and so.
There's a Caesarean Israel too.
Mm-hmm. But that's down south, isn't it?
Yeah. That's
So, what happened was that these Turks are moving westward, and the Byzantines just thinking, well, we'll show them what's what. They've already taken most of the Muslims have already taken much of the Byzantine world, haven't they? So, but they lose. They lose big. So big, in fact, that most of Asia Minor, as it was called, now Turkey, is lost to the Turks. And this is, of course, considered a disaster. What will happen to Christianity? What will happen to our civilization? Will Constantinople be the next thing to fall? Well, in fact, it won't be. But the Byzantines didn't know that. 1071 then has got to be considered a critical date, because I don't think, if it hadn't been for that, I don't think the Byzantines would have been so anxious to get the Westerners involved. But they were very interested. The emperor of that day, Alexis Comnenus, and you see his dates, was and had been very concerned about gaining some Western support. He thought about mercenary troops, whatever he could gain from the West. They understood that Westerners were not necessarily their friends. I mean, the Eastern and Western churches had definitely had their problems, still do. But the Byzantines had always held out a little bribes to the Pope and others and said, how would you like for all Christians to be under your control? He said, well, they already are. No, I mean really under your control. I mean, that's the debate. The Pope says, that sounds good to me. What do I have to do for it? Oh, not that much. We just need a few thousand troops to fight Turks. That's our Alexis Comnenus, and we have, of all things, his daughter's memoirs. Isn't that amazing? Anna Komnena, a remarkable document, which is her account of her father's reign. Just a treasure if you want to know about the Crusades. It's called the Alexiad. And obviously, as one would think from offspring, it is very biased in speaking of his negotiations with the West and his travails with the Turks and all the rest. But to think of having a work by this brilliant woman about her father's reign is just a treasure for people who are studying the First Crusade and trying to understand it from the Byzantine perspective. But yes, the Byzantines did want Western support, and they held out the base, or the bait, I should say, of the Orthodox acknowledging papal supremacy. I mean, that is icing on the cake. You know, that is just, makes you just lick your lips to think about those folks go, yeah, this is a great day for us. it's a major factor. I think it's very significant, and I get along by saying, I mean, the popes, who normally considered the Germans, remember, as the emperors. You know, you're saying, well, are you playing with these other emperors? Who do you really love? Well, you were real hateful, and we don't like you right now. So, because they were involved in this struggle, Gregory VII versus Henry IV. So, we are reaching out to the Greeks. What are you going to do about it? Lousy Germans. So, yeah, the popes are having their problems with their own Western emperors. And this is a way to show them who's the boss. So I think that you need to remember. I always think we need to remember the papal imperial conflict in the 11th century to appreciate why did the popes really push these crusades so hard. Take that, so-called emperor. You know, yeah, I said, ugh, you love those Greeks. Oh, you know, that kind of thing, yeah. So, what are we going to do? Well, we're going, as Pope, to call to all Catholic warriors to come together to fight for the Pope against the enemy, more or less. And there it was. And this has called, and I would ask Americanists to forgive me to compare this with the Gettysburg Address or other major speeches. I'm afraid that would sound hurtful, but I have my distinguished colleague here will forgive me if I do say that the Council of Clermont, the oration by the Pope, is considered one of the greatest of all orations in history. Yeah, the crowds just went wild. And they were crowds. You notice where it is, not in a certain country that starts with G and has 3 syllables. I think not, you losers. So, they can just go to hell. I'm going to France, because this particular Pope was Urban II. He was what we call a Gregorian. He was looked upon Gregory VII as his mentor, as we say today. And so this little project that he preached in 1095 was held in Clermont, France, which we used to have an Auburn study program there in the summers down south central France. Some of you may remember when the French department carried students there, Clermont. Anyway, there at the cathedral, Urban, who was himself French, preached this great oration which so stirred fervor that the people cried out, God wills it, periodically during his address, which didn't have that much to say about the Greeks, but it had a lot to say about the Turks, paganism, young men who might need some positive activities. He brought up a variety of topics, all of which were geared towards gaining support, and he got it. This Council of Clermont was very, very successful. Of course, you can't have a whole crusade just on one speech, but it can get people excited. And it's that sort of thing, I'm sure, that at the end of the speech the Pope would be saying, and now outside the cathedral there will be all kinds of people to answer any questions you may have, and if you can write, you can sign up, or someone else can help you who is literate. Yeah, I mean, this is just the beginning, because papal agents now will spread out through most parts of Christian Europe that don't start with G, and try to encourage warriors everywhere, including England, Norman England now, to join up. So it will take 4 years before they go. Sadly, was a preliminary peasants' crusade. This crusade was brought about by certain popular preachers. And I think it is significant to understand how this word reaches the masses of people, and not just the elite class who really have the wherewithal to go, because you couldn't go, without a horse or armor and all the rest of the necessary wherewithal. These individuals had nothing to lose. They were going simply as fanatics, I would say, who went, and it's told it. I was telling you all about the book by the Emperor's daughter, and talking about the reaction of her father when they came, and he's saying, this isn't really what I had in mind. Hey, everybody, thanks for coming. I tell you what, we've got this big old boat, and we're going to load y'all up. Y'all want to go fight some Turks, don't you? And they say, yeah, we. So, y'all all get on the boat. So, sure enough, he got them across the Bosporus, where the Turks could complete his job of eliminating them, this peasant wave. The killing of Jews as they went along their journey to Constantinople is clearly a sign of the fanaticism with which individuals were imbued. I mean, what had the Jews done? They had nothing to do with it, except everything is about slaughtering people who in some way are supposedly involved in anti-Christian activities. Although these Jewish communities had been in these towns and cities for centuries. So it's, yeah, exactly. And they're first, but they should have known to be Christian. So that's the kind of thing. And so this is what we will do. And so that's a sure sign of the way this medieval society is evolving. They are very conscious about who they are, and they hate everybody who is not. So that's going on, these killings of Jews. The Franks now are going to arrive by the end of the century, meaning now the individuals who will be the real crusaders. It'll take them that long. And again, I'm not sure that the emperor is pleased with what he gets. What he wanted, what he expected, was that the Pope would provide mercenary forces. And instead, these people have their own agenda. Sort of like they get there to Constantinople and say, which way to Jerusalem? And of course, the Byzantine emperor say, wait, fellas, this is about me, not you. Don't you understand? Was there some confusion back in Rome? I mean, did you get the wrong idea about what was going on? It's like, no, we've got the right idea. You're off, you Greek loser. I mean, we never want to think that there was some sort of harmony and love between the Greeks and the Latins. There was always a difference of purpose. So, once these true crusaders, that is to say, the knights, and there were many thousands of them, in addition to the elite force on horseback, when they did arrive at Constantinople, they included not one king, but lots of prominent noblemen, including this one, whom I find interesting. He was the son of William the Conqueror. Robert, he's known as Curthose, short stocking. And he was Duke of Normandy because his father, who didn't like him, had to make him Duke of Normandy thanks to the laws of primogeniture. But he wouldn't give him England, so he needed a lot of, as we say now, funding. So he went to his brother, who was King of England. He said, "Hey, kid, you want England? I've got to pawn it. I've got to go on the crusade. You've got England, and now I'm Duke of Normandy, so I need to pawn Normandy." That's what I meant, Normandy. So his brother said, "Sure, loser, I'll take it. You know those pawns, I mean, that's not good." So he actually pawned Normandy fighting as a crusader, and he thought I think he had a great time. I mean, I'd be worried about Normandy if I were there. I'd get real nervous, but he didn't like his brother either. His brother didn't like him, so not a happy family. So there's Robert, Duke of Normandy. He's one of the leaders, and he is really fired up, and they're all just so excited. And I mean, if you pawned your whole duchy, and many of you travelers, you know Normandy, that's lovely. You wouldn't pawn it, would you? I mean, you'd be glad of it. So off for the new year, but they just thought this was just the greatest thing alive, to get to go on crusade. Were they really concerned about the holy places of Jerusalem and so forth? Maybe, maybe not. But that, even if yes, that was only a part of it. They wanted adventures and new opportunities. The First Crusade is the only one of the major crusades to end successfully, because going south, they did manage to conquer Jerusalem. That had not necessarily been on the agenda of the Greek emperor, the Byzantine emperor. They were there, of course, to throw the Turks out of Asia Minor. Oops, we're going south instead. And you say, well, what did the Byzantine emperor think about that? Not a whole lot. He said, gee, I wish I had never sent that letter to the Pope. You know, it's like, but you get what you asked for. So they are there, and they're all, in addition to conquering other cities along the way, they would take Jerusalem, which, of course, was their dream, their desire, and their dearest wish. And I'm sure the folks in Rome were very, very excited. And here is why. Notice the areas that are in purple. Those are going to be what are called the Crusader states. The Crusader states, they are going to create Western-run governments. And you got to figure it's minority rule, because all these folks live in these areas. They've never been ruled by Westerners before, but these folks are saying, wow, we like it here. This is great. Now, you people that are going to be ruled by us, we've got some new rules. We've got some new things you need to learn. Latin, Catholicism, and a few other things. But these will be 4 states, including one kingdom. You see that, the kingdom of Jerusalem. And in those 4 states, they will be entirely, if I can use the term, feudalized, meaning that all 3 of the other states will be in feudal obedience to the king of Jerusalem. We have a whole book, folks, of feudal law from the Crusader kingdoms. Now, again, put that by your bedside, Carol. See, you'll be up all night. It will have you so stimulated. Yes. That wasn't. You know, scholars of feudalism have often commented that was the most perfect feudal society ever, because it didn't just arise; they imposed it. They brought in and said, you know, we're going to create all these feudal hierarchies, feudal legal systems. It lasted for most of the century before the Turks recovered it. These 4 states, then, you see them there, Antioch, Tripoli, and Edessa up there. Now, look at the Muslim world. That's kind of interesting. You see it ruled Egypt. See down there the Fatimids? That is an Arab ruled area, Arab Muslims. And then look over here at Seljuks. Do you see that? And that's your Turkish. So it's hardly that the Muslims are all together. They themselves are split. But in terms of the area ruled by Christians, it is still relatively small. This individual would be the first Christian king, Count Baldwin, and the idea being that he got there and they said, would you like to be Louis, king of Jerusalem? And he said, yeah. Now, you think that would be a sort of empty victory, but you think how many people had to be massacred for that takeover? Jews as well as Muslims. But when that part of it was over, they wanted to establish Christian kingship. So he just never went home. He stayed in Jerusalem because here he's a king. He's just a count back home. And they say they really did adapt to living, in what we would consider the tropics, I'm sure, gosh. Going all the way from France to living in modern-day Israel would be quite a change. But they have all their ways with them. And no one says to them, well, that's not the way we do it here. This is the way we do it because we're Westerners and we do Latin Catholic. So I think that's just kind of interesting. Now, 1187, that's the end of that. So this is not like British India. It doesn't the imperialism of the modern sort lasts longer, but these Latin kingdoms do have their time. And as such, they will play an important part. So, feudal ties, fealty to the king, the papacy elated, I'm sure. It worked. It was worth it all. Some people are hurt. I'm sure the Byzantine emperor's not too happy about the things that worked out. Because, this is supposed to be about me, not y'all. Did anybody forget? And so you say, oh, you mean there's not love between the Catholic and the Orthodox after the First Crusade? I don't think so. There's a lot more hurt. I can promise you that. Anger, even. And they are definitely not going to submit to the papacy. But I'm not sure at that particular point the Pope is concerned about that as he is about their great victories that will lead for temporary rule ending at the end of that 12th century. But again, the fascination of establishing the feudal ways as well as the Latin and Catholic procedures in their faith are interesting aspects left by this First Crusade. And we'll pick it up there with the second. Thursday the 3rd. You'll get an email. Please come back if you can. Okay. I'll see y'all. Thank you.